Guillaume Loriot, welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. We know that DigiComp is often referred as Rolls-Royce, and the part which is responsible for scrutinizing mergers is one of the key mechanisms of this entire architecture. You are in charge, you are Deputy Director General with primary responsibilities mergers. So I wanted to invite you maybe to start with a kind of brief description of the main components of this mechanism.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Alesh, for having me on your channel. Very pleased to be speaking to students, and I hope that this interview will be useful for students to have a very practical view of things on EU merger control. So hopefully it will be one of the additional tools for them. On your question, which is indeed very important, what is the practical organization that we have here in DG competition? And that's one that we've had now for the last 20 years, since the big reform in 2004 by Commissioner Monti of the structure of DG competition, where we have what we call a matrix structure, where on the one hand you have sectoral directorates like energy, tech, IT, telecoms, media. You have financial services, you have industries, consumer goods, and you have transport. And so you have directors in charge for all instruments of these directorates. And then on top of that, you have each Deputy Director General responsible for each instrument. So I'm in charge of merger control. There's another DDG, a Deputy Director General, in charge of antitrust, and another one in charge of state aid, and then there's a Director General. So I've been the DDG for mergers for the last 5 years. I worked also in mergers when I was younger, as a case handler, as a head of unit, and as well in private practice or when I was in court. So I've spent many years in different positions in that area. And concretely now, in the network, what we call the merger network, we are, if I have everyone included, we have about 160 people. If I include myself, if I include the directors, if I include the registry. We have 12 managers, so heads of unit and deputies head of unit, each in their own sectors. We have a policy unit with about a dozen of policy officers who coordinate and who launch and are in charge of the policy projects, like the market definition notice, like now the launch of the review of the guidelines. And we have about 90 case handlers. So, it's not a lot. We're reviewing about 400 transactions a year. We have a big role in the EU economy, but also, globally, because obviously merger control is one of the areas where the Commission and DG Comp in particular is really one of the leaders, frankly, in terms of competition enforcement. So that's about it, about the structural organization. I'm sure you can find a graph on our website for your students.
Well, I wanted to ask, we often hear that, or we know, that the Commission decides in college that there is no specific ministry for competition. It's all ultimately, at least juristically speaking, it is decisions in college. How much flexibility does DG Comp have? Does the Commissioner for Competition, we used to call for competition, have in this broader kind of constellation of things? Is it changing depending on circumstances, or it's something kind of it's constanta which is pretty stable?
Well, first, to be in practice, I mean, there are empowerments. So there's a system of empowerments, and you have cases that are very simple, where the decision is taken by the commissioner or even the DG for simplified cases. It goes to the college, so it's a college decision when it's a phase 2 decision, and there's a debate about the college where really there's an issue that needs to be debated. And then, there are discussions about, what options may be taken and so on. It's very rare, because one must bear in mind first that, it's about law enforcement. So there are principles of law. It's not a purely discretionary matter. It's not that you can say black or white. Facts matter. I'm sure we will we will discuss that. So there's a strong legal overview, there's a strong judicial scrutiny compared to other policies. This is something that is about law enforcement. So there's a framework, there are legal rules and principles to which the college itself is bound. So the margin for the discussions is obviously, is something that deserves a debate, but there are always constant principles that apply. So that I hope answers your question.
It does. It does. And yet we know from, if you look retrospectively at the evolution of European merger control regime, we know that we started with a kind of rule of thumb, pretty much, evaluations, which in course of time, obviously because of the stakes and the expertise which the parties are capable to engage with, and thus the Commission has to match, it becomes more and more complex, more and more nuanced, more and more heavyweight in terms of data and evidence collected and examined. Can you reflect upon this? Is it ever complicated and maybe even unnecessarily complicated? If it is there any way back? Is it on a continuous trajectory of getting even more complicated?
So that's an excellent question, but I think there are several layers of debate to have, because you started by saying, well, initially it was a rule of thumb, and I want to go back to that. And then your question about whether the merger control has become more and more sophisticated, I will answer that as well. But let me start with the kind of perception that initially it was a rule of thumb. I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true. One thing that the students must bear in mind, and it's never underlined enough, the specificity of EU merger control compared to many other systems is one where the Commission takes decisions that are motivated either way. So when it clears a transaction, which is the case in 90% of cases, even more, I think, then you have to, in the cases where you have an investigation, and so on, you have to explain why the market is considered European or global. You have to explain why you don't have concerns. And this is and this decision can be challenged in court by third parties. But also it means that the Commission, in its assessment, is giving guidance. It's explaining why, it will consider, and normally it applies for future cases. We can be part, but obviously, we try to be consistent unless there are new elements. This is very specific to EU merger control. In the US, for example, they only prosecute cases. You never know when they clear. So this is a black box, I suppose, but you cannot check. It's never been the case for us. So even when it started in 1990, you're saying it's a rule of thumb. Not really, maybe the decisions were shorter, yes, but it was all motivated, explained. There were decisions that were challenged, criticized, and so on, either way. So that's my first point, because I think it's very important to realize that the EU is a community based on the rule of law, and it has always been, and especially competition enforcement has always been. I mean, the case law, the court has always been very vigilant. But obviously, we have all become, all of us, more sophisticated. Why is that? And that's your second question, the second part of your question, which is very, very good and very relevant. And I think, to me, there are several factors. I think the big thing that happened was the evolution as of 2004. So the time where actually we adopted the new merger regulation. And there were two elements, I think, that one has to bear in mind. The first one is that the EU moved towards a more effects-based approach, less structuralist, maybe less ordoliberal, where we had to assess the ability, but also the economic incentives for a company to, after the merger, to behave in a certain way. So it meant that our analysis was more sophisticated, and it was more economic. It was less structural in terms of market shares, dominance, and so on. And that was the reform of 2004, to move from the notion of dominance to the test of significant impediment to effective competition, which is an effects-based approach, where you have to assess many different elements so as not to intervene excessively or too simplistically. That was the call of every lawyer, every economist, and of judges. And that's the second element that happened in 2004. And one is the result of, in fact, the increased judicial scrutiny. Remember, there were the judgments in Ertour, Schneider-Legrand, Tetra-Laval, and others, where there was a heavy criticism by the court about the fact that the assessments were, too not based on an effects-based approach, essentially not economic enough. And also, and we've seen since then that in many cases, including clearance decisions, the court is very, very meticulous in making sure that we motivate our assessment on every plea that is made, every relevant argument that is made. Actually, we have examples of a phase 2 decision, a clearance decision, where we were annulled on one part of the case that was not significant, but where we hadn't explained why we found no concern. That was 4 years ago, for example. So there's been, and rightly so, a very rigorous judicial scrutiny on our decisions, especially when we block, but also when we clear. We just had a case three days ago that went up to the court. It was a clearance, and that was a big litigation. And so that's another phenomenon. When there's increased judicial scrutiny on the one hand, where you have very sophisticated economists and lawyers on the other hand, making many arguments to which you have to respond, it is difficult to have very short decisions. I would love it. Everyone and my teams would love it. But realistically, if we do that, we will be challenged for not answering the pleas. And I think these two elements, one which is substantive, which is, the effects-based approach, it has a cost. You need to assess the economics, the incentives, and so on. It means, more sophisticated analysis when the case is difficult, and more judicial scrutiny as well, for many, good reasons. But all of this means that in decisions that, deserve an investigation, then indeed the decisions have been longer and longer and more sophisticated. The good thing is that we've managed to apply a simplified procedure to all the cases, which for us, are very easy, a no-brainer. And then we have a simple process that we have actually improved even very recently. And actually 90% of our cases now happen under this simplified procedure where the decision is one page. It's only one page. And, generally they're not challenged, but because they are very, very simple. So if you take things in perspective, yes, for the complex investigations, it has been increasingly heavy for the parties, but also for us, mainly for us, the Commission. But if you look at the bigger picture, it has become much more simple in the vast majority of cases. I'm talking 90% out of 400. So I think that gives you a perspective on, these shortcuts about the perception of our work.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. But let me continue with this and looking at another element, another stereotype perhaps about merger policy in general and EU merger control in particular. The very DNA of merger control is we try to speculate about the future.
Yeah.
And we know at least even interpreting something which happened in the past is gives you very fertile soil for different scenarios of what had happened. And hypothesizing about the future is probably even more generous in terms of speculations and building up nice, attractive stories and then rebutting them. At least in the theory, in academic discussions, we see more and more people starting saying that, well, obviously the scope is different. Some say there is always margin of appreciation, room for interpretation, and others would say everything goes, it's kind of agnostic and everything is relative. It's all about how skillful the storytellers are. They can construct out of legal and economic facts and gloss us a nice AI generated or whatever generated picture. Where are we in terms of the practice in this within this wide scope of possibilities?
Okay, that's also a very relevant question, and I think it's largely a caricature. Why is that? Indeed, I mean, merger control is a forward-looking assessment, right? But it doesn't mean, and it cannot be, a kind of speculation on the future with a crystal ball. That's not how things work. We're not allowed to do that. We don't want to do that, and this is not the reality. You have to assess what is likely to happen, either way, either to clear or to say that they might be concerned. And to say what is likely probable in itself means it's not only a mere possibility, you have to show what is more likely than not. So you have to show that there's a balance in favor of one particular scenario. And so if you start thinking about how it works, you see that the margin is not great. Why is that? Why? Because it all starts from a factual, not assessment, from the facts that you gather. Because you start your assessment after having gathered many relevant facts, whether they go one way or the other. And these facts largely then determine, what is the number one alternative versus the other option. But you see your assessment is narrowing down. And in fact, to use a very basic example, if you start in a case from the fact that the merging parties, for example, were competing vigorously in the same market, in the same country, let's say, to make it simple. For example, in bids, you have a bidding market, and clients tell you that they are number one and number two for them as an alternative, that there's only one alternative, a number three, which is, either smaller or less efficient or whatever, or that comes third in the bidding results. Well, it's very simplistic what I'm saying, but already you see that, the balance might a priori, prima facie, logically tip to a problem. You have high market shares, they are number one and two, there are only three players. Clients tell you, well, these two guys are my number one and number two choice. You start thinking, well, if I clear it, I have to be the court will ask me, why are you clearing it? What are the facts that can contradict these elements? So you see, it's very concrete. It's not about speculation. You have, as an authority, to be impartial. And the court is very vigilant on that, rightly so. You're an objective administrative authority. You can't be picking the winner and, this company, we like it, and so we will not say anything. And that's not how it works. So depending on the facts that you have in front of you, obviously the judges and us and anyone will say, well, okay, if I need to go against the fact that there might be issues, I need to have very relevant, not only arguments, but factual elements. And then, the parties will do that work. Very good lawyers will explain it. And then you will make a judgment on what is more likely than not. And vice versa. You have two companies, they're not competing in the same market. There are 10 competitors. The clients tell you, well, we don't even know the number two. I'm using a caricature, yeah? But if you go against that and find a concern, the judge will ask you, what are the elements that contradict it? So you see, that's much more concrete than people, pretend, it is. And it's very factual. And I think that's right, because the facts, it's also very useful against the politicization of that instrument. It's a judicial law enforcement instrument. We have to be impartial. That's how it was conceived by the EU legislator, because you realize also in a community of 27 member states, if there's the slightest suspicion that you have a favorable treatment towards companies from a certain country, then, that will be quashed. So I think that's the reality of things. Now, things obviously are very complex. We look at the internal documents of the companies, the business documents. We need to understand how the markets work. Sometimes, it looks like it's big, but, it looks like the merger may create a big company, but then still the market tells you shouldn't be worried, or the customers are not worried for whatever reason. And we explain that. But the facts matter. It's not a story. You see what I mean? The story comes from the facts. And I
Let
think
me
that's
paraphrase it, but absolutely resonate with my understanding of things. If we pick a random phase two case and give it to 10 impartial experts in EU competition law and policy, you think there will be consensus, or will it be 9 out of 10 will move to the A rather than B?
I think, I mean, frankly, I think when you see the very, professional lawyers and very good lawyers who know merger control well, normally they will give an advice to their own clients, right? Saying, well, this one is very risky. And we are an authority that has the reputation, and I hope it's deserved, to be quite predictable, because we have a consistent case practice. We publish our decisions. As I said, we publish also our phase one decisions. So normally, a very experienced lawyer will see whether the risk is high or not that this merger will be problematic. Sometimes there are elements they don't know because the market comes with new elements. It may happen. And frankly, I think lawyers, well, I know this community, afterwards, that 9 out of 10 lawyers will have provided the same advice to the company. But I don't think, and then there are people who are less interventionist, others are more interventionist. These are nuances, but I don't think you would find many lawyers saying, oh, this one should be unconditionally cleared and this one should be completely blocked. Then the question would be more on remedies, what is a suitable remedy? I think that's a fair picture.
Let me then move on and ask you, based on this kind of monosemic perception or interpretation or reading of merger policy as quite monosemic exercise, without caricaturizing it to the opposite extreme, saying that it's axiomatic and everything can be done mechanistically, so to say, of course. If you look at digital markets, which is the thematic focus of our hub, and we often hear criticism that we've been too permissive. All jurisdictions, not necessarily EU only, and thus there is a kind of political message, let's take Draghi report and the message about kind of changing the optics vis-a-vis mergers in telecommunication sector. Does it fit into your equation of things?
Well, you have many questions in one now. I mean, there's the issue about looking retrospectively at digital mergers versus, the Draghi report, the role of merger control, and then the claims of the telecom industry or some parts of the telecom sector. I mean, on the digital, I think one of the most interesting part of your question is about digital markets and the evolution. And obviously, it's like, making history. When people judge things when it's anachronic, when you make the judgment of today at a time where, you didn't know. So obviously, in the early 2000s, we didn't know what we know now. So it's a bit, always a bit easy to compare, apples and pears. But I think we've learned. But not only we've learned, we've seen very early on in digital mergers, that we have intervened as well earlier than anyone. The issues around interoperability, already in the years 2000s, I think we had seen that. But I think there are phenomena that it took time to completely understand, and they are complex issues, because in digital markets there are first different types of markets. Issues around platforms, intermediation may be different from other tech markets. The phenomenon of network effects, direct or indirect, the flywheel effect and so on, we've seen it, and it took time to understand. It went beyond what we had seen before. The winner takes all phenomenon in some markets, the role of data in some markets, the multi-homing versus the single homing, but also consumer behavior. So I think first, there's not one recipe for all digital cases. There are different types of markets, there are different dynamics. So, let's not pretend we know everything about them. But at least what would have been worrying is if merger control had not evolved, despite the digital markets and digital mergers coming up, but it has, non-horizontal mergers, vertical mergers, conglomerate mergers, many often happen in digital markets, and we have intervened in many of them because we saw that indeed, despite not being competitors, because of the network effects or other factors I mentioned, there was an issue around interoperability, for example. So I think in new merger control, maybe it has evolved too late. Some will say yes. Google DoubleClick, for example, is an example. But I think we've been at least the ones who have evolved the first ones to take action in some cases. Microsoft LinkedIn is an example, and other Google cases and so on. And at the time, obviously, I was working also in tech matters because I was a director for antitrust in digital matters, and it is obvious that what I saw happening in antitrust matters had a connection with what we could foresee in some digital mergers. So yes, I think it has evolved, and that's why we need to update also our guidelines in this respect. Now, on your question about Draghi and Letta, I think these are other types of issues. It's more about, I think, on the Letta, I think there's a very relevant point. I mean, beyond competition and merger control, same for Draghi. It's around, the call for a single market, the call for, making Europe really competitive. I think, as the IMF has underscored, the hurdles within the single market in Europe amount, just for goods, they amount to a tariff around 45%. If you think about that, and we're talking about the trade war, which is, obviously a problem, but within the single market, we have these obstacles which make Europe not as competitive as it should be. So merger control, is important, but compared to that, it's a very small issue. Now, on merger control, obviously, when we see that there are national markets, and maybe that's your question on telecoms, we see that there are still many national markets in many sectors, ranging from energy to telecoms, you name them. Even in banking, we're still calling for a banking union and saving unions. And merger control is not a hurdle. Usually, merger control allows for the cross-border consolidation because there's no overlap in these national markets. But the problem very often either comes from, some protectionist actions, or because the firms just want to consolidate within a national market, right? Like in some telecom markets, some players would like to become again a monopoly, ideally. But it will not make Europe more competitive. You will still have 27 companies. I mean, is that what we want? I don't think so. And I think Draghi himself has underlined that he doesn't want national champions. He wants European ones. And the question is, what is a European champion? What is a champion? Is it a monopoly, or is it someone competing? It's someone competing, in my view. It's like, in sport. You're not a champion if you don't have people you compete with. You need many competitors to be strong. And I think that's what we need in Europe as well.
Some might say that, if others are using doping, which is undetected, or where there is a big lag, then however fiercely and enthusiastically you train your muscles, you are still in the second tier. You are still not qualified to the Champions League. And it looks that some jurisdictions are very meticulous with trying to inject into their national champions some prohibited materials. And the EU obviously responds to this, yeah. And so it's probably not a question, just a comment.
No, but you're right. I think there are two. I mean, if I make it very simple, there are two kinds of boosting your competitiveness, right? One, which is what you call the doping, which is essentially subsidies. And I think you have in mind, jurisdictions like, China, let's say it, where, there are a lot of state subsidies, and that may create a problem in our market of overcapacity, companies being more price competitive, but on the basis of subsidies. And I think the EU and DG Comp has been working on foreign subsidies to, protect fair competition, right? That's one issue, and we need to address it. We can't address it under merger control. We can address it under, pushing back against this in the foreign subsidies regulation. Still, it doesn't mean that creating a monopoly in Europe will make us more competitive even against the Chinese. I think you're more competitive when your economy, has a choice, make your industry resilient by having a choice between different suppliers. That's one thing. The other way of boosting your economy is to have scale with a wide market, right? With a big customer base where there are efficiencies and you don't need to face the regulatory hurdles in each and every market. That's what the US have done. They have one big single market of 300 whatever million inhabitants. They have one telecom market. They have one energy market. They have one financial investment and banking market. So the companies have scale, but they preserve competition because there's competition. And that's the problem, that we don't have that, because we still have 27 national markets in most sectors. So we can't reach the scale that is needed to be as efficient as we should be. And it also restricts competition. So I think it's not less competition that may make us more competitive. It's having competition on a wider scale. And that's what I think every serious expert, from Draghi to Letta to Mrs. Lagarde to every observer in IO economy, the Jean Tirole of this world, are saying. And I think we should listen very carefully.
Merger control is also much more in merger control. We more often than in antitrust introduce different types of behavioral and structural remedies, and thus when we talk about the appetite to shape, let's say, competition in digital markets, or maybe even digital markets themselves, we often look at merger control where this mechanism of designing remedies, but also assessing them and maybe testing the different types of remedies before introducing them is much more ubiquitous endeavor. So I wonder if I can invite you to reflect upon the art of designing remedies.
Well, it's not an art, definitely not, and we don't want it to be an art. We want to be a rigorous science, if I may use the metaphor. And meaning it has to be consistent, it has to be somehow predictable, it has to be effective above all. So the EU DG had a policy for now a few years after a big remedy study that was conducted in the late 2000s, to have a remedies policy that is consistent with the case law and consistent with its experience, which is namely that, there is a principle that a merger is a structural change on the market. If the structural change on the market is problematic, you need to solve it structurally. So the principle is that, if there's an issue, you remove the problem structurally by divesting a piece of your activity to make sure that, you keep as many competitors as needed. And that's the normal principle. And, I think the court has backed us up on that, but obviously always saying you cannot exclude per se that there would be another form of remedy. So you need to examine seriously whether a non-structural remedy would be acceptable. And that's what we do. And that's what we've done by way of exception, as I said. So in practice, it may be indeed that sometimes, because the divestiture is not even, a way to solve the problem, especially in non-horizontal mergers. There were cases where we accepted what we call access remedies or interoperability remedies, because the market, would find that logical, because the problem was not as significant as to, really intervene otherwise, because of many, convergent problems. It doesn't work in every case. We had many cases where we said, no, a non-structural remedy wouldn't work because it's not long enough, it's not effective enough, the market doesn't like it, it's too complex, and so on. I can elaborate on that if you want. But I think we've been trying to be consistent with these principles for the business so that they can also assess the operation, for our case handlers, also, politically, to show that there's consistency, so as to be rigorous. And we've tried to do that. And if you look at last year, I think there was no non-structural remedy in our cases. There were only structural remedies in both horizontal and non-horizontal cases. Obviously, in horizontal cases, it is even more exceptional that there would be a non-structural remedy, because normally in a horizontal case, you add one, you direct competitors merge in the same market. So normally you divest what is in the problem in the market.
What is your observation about effectiveness of remedy? How effective they are expected to be? How effective could they be? How much should we expect from the remedies to deliver? Is it how ambitious we should be and how moderate with our expectations should be?
Obviously, there's a very strict monitoring of the remedies. We have trustees, we have reports, we make a very detailed assessment of a purchaser, we look at its business plan. So it's not something that we just validate. There's a very tight control. And that's why, on the normal remedies, which are structural remedies, divesting a company, for example, there's already a lot of work going into that to make sure that the remedy is viable, that the employees stay, the key personnel, that the purchaser is someone who will compete, and so on. That demands a lot of work that you don't see. And that's why already doing that is very demanding. So going into a non-structural remedy is even more demanding. I mean, it means years of monitoring. So it has to be something very focused, targeted, simple, and exceptional. And that's what's happening. But no, I don't want to give you the impression that there's no monitoring. There is a monitoring, and we see in markets where there are divestitures, it's very rare that there's a problem. Normally, there's a buyer who continues competing, even sometimes better or not, but there's competition being maintained, and that's our goal. When it's more tricky, it's about interoperability remedies, to make sure that they commit to interoperability, that everyone can have the same APIs and so on. But let me assure you that if there's a problem, the market comes to us and tells us, well, it doesn't work, and then we have to fix it. It's very exceptional because we make sure that we have all the trustees in place to do it. But that's why we don't accept non-structural remedies very frequently, because it demands even more work than a divestiture.
Let us move to the merger control itself, and particularly Article 22 of EU merger regulation, and a recent high-profile Illumina Grail case. If I may ask you, please, to outline, to offer to us an exposition of the motivation to interpret Article 22 and the implications of the case itself.
So there are many dimensions to this case, the Illumina Grail case, which was a case in the biotech industry where a big company was buying one small innovator specialized in the detection of elaborating a kind of detection system of cancer before the cancer arises, so asymptomatic detection in a way. I don't want to go into the details of that because the point was more about there are many dimensions to the case, but one element essential to the case was, we've had heard, especially as you mentioned, in tech mergers, specialists, academia saying, well, merger enforcers should look also at acquisitions, very often by large tech companies, but large companies of small nascent companies that don't have a turnover, or very small one, but still play a very important role on the market, or likely to play a very important role on the market when the market is a very innovative one, where there are many dynamics that come up in the market and that will change the market. And remember, I think the background to that, for example, was Facebook, Instagram. You know, when Facebook bought Instagram, I think there were 20 employees, and it was a very small company. It was reviewed at the time by the OFT, I think the UK OFT. It wasn't even reaching the thresholds, obviously, of the, and they have a voluntary system in the UK, so you know it couldn't be reviewed in the EU. But obviously, you know, at the time, you know, no one thought that Instagram could develop as much as it had in the meantime. And the question was always, should it be approved, because it was a very nascent and small player, but it was disrupting the Facebook system. So it was a nascent competitor. So that's an example. But you know, this happened also in the biotech industry. What happens if you have a very small player that is putting a vaccine or developing a vaccine that will compete vigorously with the incumbent? The issue of pipeline products, should they be merger controlled to prevent this competition disappearing? So there was this whole debate in competition circles about the need to scrutinize thoroughly those exceptional mergers where you have a target that is very small in terms of turnover, but very high in terms of value potentially, and that would develop into an innovative disruptor. And that's what we need in the economy, you know, these innovative small firms that develop and grow. This is the model that we would like to have. And so against the background of that, at the time, the Commission had conducted a study to see what other cases we missed. Should we review the EU merger regulation, or should we, you know, find another way to control these mergers in a proportionate way? Then when we did the study, we looked into pharma, we looked into tech, we looked into many sectors with the data from you know, database and so on. And we saw that there was a few proportion of these cases that, you know, would have deserved a review. Not many, not 90%, maybe 5%, I mean, a very small share. So it meant two things. One is that you should find a system to review this type of transactions. But second, you should not create a system where everyone has to notify every transaction, because it would be disproportionate to the size of the problem. Yet, one should review this, what someone called killer acquisitions, which is a bit of a, you know, a very narrow term, because I think the issues are much more than just killing the target. It means, you know, acquiring a target that is significant. I think the Draghi report also has mentioned that we need to find a system to look into these issues. So what we developed at the time is a doctrine through a reading of Article 22 of the merger regulation that allows member states to refer cases to the Commission. And we said, well, member states can refer these type of cases to the Commission even when the case is below their own threshold, because it was the origin of the Dutch clause to allow member states who don't even have a merger control to refer these cases. And so we developed that theory, that reading, a very literal reading of Article 22. And on that basis, we looked at the Illumina Grail transaction. So maybe that's phase one. Sorry, it's a bit long, but if you don't understand that, then you don't understand really the background. We looked at the transaction and we found very strong concerns, and the FTC at the time also found concerns. I make it short, but obviously the question was first whether we were right to look at the case, whether we had jurisdiction, and in parallel there was the General Court looking at the case while we were doing our phase two assessment. And before we took a decision, the General Court said, yes, the Commission is right, Article 22 should be read in a way that allows to look at this type of cases. So we took the decision and blocked the transaction. And I think the most important part of the case is not the jurisdictional part is important, but the most important is the content of the decision, the assessment of the dynamic effects of innovation in merger control, because it was a very important case about the race to the market, the uncertainty in the market. How do you make sure that, you know, one innovator will not be privileged by the upstream monopoly, which was essentially it. So we wanted to make sure that all the rivals could have access to all the technologies of the upstream Illumina player. And we thought that if the merger would proceed, it would not be the case. So we blocked it. And then, unfortunately, the Court of Justice on appeal took a different position and said, well, we disagree with the General Court. Article 22 should not allow member states to refer cases and mergers when it's below their own thresholds. You may agree or disagree, but that meant that the case, then was no longer relevant. Our decision was void. We had to stop, proceeding. Whereas we had done many things, including ensuring that Griel is put back on the market, and now it's actually back on the market. I mean, the consequence of that judgment, unfortunately, are not really better for the market. It's not better for the single market and the certainty and the predictability, because what's happening is that member states who wanted to be able to refer these cases to us, now they're introducing systems, rightly so, to make sure that they can call in transactions of that kind to be able to refer them to us, which means that they're introducing some kinds of voluntary system, as you have in the UK, for example. So nothing new, but I think that compared to what we had done in Article 22, it will create much more, I think for companies, maybe much more possibilities of being looked at in their own transactions. But, so be it. I think that's the consequence of the judgment.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you very much, Guillaume. My last question is an invitation to offer some collegial recommendations to those who wanted to maybe in the future join this dream job at DigiComp, students who are completing their law degree and who are interested in EU competition law. Maybe some capabilities, some skills which are of higher demand than usual, maybe some mistakes which they have to avoid.
Oh, that's a very good question. Frankly, I'm impressed by the young generation. I think they are much better than we were. They have many skills. They have access to many different types of studies and universities. They travel. They speak different languages. So I see that, and I think they should continue. I think my best advice is always do what you like. Don't that's the best way to be enthusiastic and having energy in what you do, whether you do law, whether you do economics, whether you do data science. I think if you want to work in merger control and you have an appetite for that, obviously I think that will be useful, either of these areas, and actually that's what I see. If you speak different languages, obviously I think it means that you're interested in Europe and having European colleagues. So that's also a recipe. I think having different experience, in the private sector, if you're a lawyer in a law firm, as an economist, I think it's always good to look at all the sides of the business and understand business realities, and having a mindset that is open to the market realities and understanding this. I think that's one of my best advice. We like it when people have had some experience before, because they already are mature enough to understand that the world is complex and markets are complex. So that's part of the common sense approach that we call for. And that's it. I think they all know what they have to do, and we're always eager to recruit young, energetic, qualified people with some experience.
Guillaume Loriot, thank you very much indeed for sharing with us all these great ideas and your expert knowledge.
Very good. Thank you so much, Olesh.